My name is Nicholas Tai Hoang Nguyen. I'm the Public Disclosure Officer at the NATO Archives. What that basically means is I coordinate the declassification and public disclosure of NATO information for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization.
Welcome to The Vietnamese. I'm your host, Kenneth Nguyen. Being part of a culture of nearly 100 million Vietnamese people in the world today comes with a lot of pain, proud history, and privilege. Join me as I highlight and explore the Vietnamese experience from all over the world.
I ask most of my guests these days, what does it mean to be Vietnamese to you?
Well, that's an interesting question because I thought about this before coming to speak with you. And for me, I think that's a loaded question. What does it mean to be Vietnamese? For me, I think for me, my answer is probably rooted in a specific, experience and a moment in time. Being Vietnamese for me, having kind of, let's say, experienced leaving Vietnam, having been, let's say, kind of partial, being, I don't want to say an eyewitness, but, being a result of, one of the major historical events of the 20th century. Learning about it in several ways in popular culture, through oral histories, through world history, through international history, positioning myself with that knowledge and learning about myself in relation to my heritage, my Vietnamese heritage has, I think it's very much informed by that. I find myself in terms of being Vietnamese, it's changed over time. It has evolved with my growing understanding of where not only I stand in relation to Vietnam, but where Vietnam stands in relation to the 20th century. So it's an evolving question. It's very important to me, and I think it's my Vietnamese identity. It's always been there, but it's needed to be excavated. It's needed to be explored. And I think that, I understand you asked that question of all your guests, and I'm sure the answers are going to be extremely different, basically, especially at a generational level. And for me, I guess I find myself almost in between the generations. I'm a first wave, I'm a refugee, but born and raised in North America. So I'm very much, on two ends of that spectrum, right? I take with me the traditions of a previous generation and living it, but transposed to a different environment, and watching those traditions both evolve and perpetuate and circulate, and still at the same time being rooted in the past, but kind of moving, mutating towards something else as as the children, as our children and our children's children's pass it along, and how they change from, let's say, over here where we are versus how they kind of mutated back home. And what does home mean? And then these are questions that I think have dominated my life, and as they change, they're always rooted back to my Vietnamese identity.
There's a lot to unpack there, and hopefully we'll do that in this episode. How did your family resettle after 1975?
Well, we left Vietnam. We left Saigon actually on April 29th, 1975. Okay, so my father was a helicopter pilot for the South Vietnamese Army, and he actually flew us out the day before the war ended. We landed on the USS Hancock, and we ended up, after landing on the Hancock, we went to Guam, and then from Guam we went to Camp Pendleton, and then from Camp Pendleton we ended up going to Canada. Our first stop in Canada was Regina, Saskatchewan. We stayed there for 3 months, and then we ended up moving westwards to Calgary, Alberta, and that's where my parents really kind of put some roots down, where where we grew up, me and my brother. My brother's 2 years younger than I am, and that's where we basically settled until I left for university. So my entire childhood was spent in Calgary, Alberta.
I understand your father, there's a significance to your father's story in the visual history of the Vietnam War. Can you go into that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, and I think this is part of like has really shaped and informed, like how I think about myself as Vietnamese, and my relationship to history with a capital H. Um, so when I say that my father was a helicopter pilot and he flew us out of Vietnam, there's an image that was taken, a very famous image. The photographer was Nick Wheeler. It was taken on the dock of the USS Hancock. It's an aircraft carrier. It was published in the May 12th issue of Newsweek magazine. And there they were reporting about the evacuation of Saigon and the eventual migration of everybody, who left and then relocated to the States. The issue is called The New Americans. And the photo, there's a photo, the Nick Wheeler's photo has an image. It's a very iconic image of a Bell Huey helicopter being dumped off the dock of the USS Hancock, and the helicopter is perpendicular to the hull. And it's captured just as it's dumped, and it's perpendicular. And the serial number on the helicopter is 959. That image has also been shown in as news footage. I've seen it being used in many documentaries. It was recently shown in the Ken Burns Vietnam documentary. It's shown at the end of The Deer Hunter. In a news clip there of archival news footage. It's also used in Eugene Jarecki's documentary Why We Fight. The reason why that image is so powerful is because it's my father's helicopter. And so when my father recognized that helicopter, I saw it in that magazine, that it's been burned in my mind, right? So much so to the fact that, the Huey is, for me, one of the most beautiful flying machines ever to grace the skies, right? There's something about it, right? And then there's, I think obviously, Hollywood cinema has, it's the Huey has really is an emblematic and iconic image of the Vietnam War. Right, the helicopter war, right? And it's hard not to think when you see, Apocalypse Now and the attack on the village that, all the Hueys coming in, right? It's just like, it's the immediate image you think. No other aircraft, even though there are many other aircraft involved in the war, the Huey is iconic. And for me to have that personal relationship to that image, and to know that it was, my father's helicopter, that photo for me, as much as it captures, like to think that, I not only when I see that photo, I was on that helicopter, I was on that ship, but what is the story behind it? And I think a lot of my life has been spent trying to understand the context of that photo. What's the story behind that image? What, like, why is it, it's obvious what the allure is, but there's a whole there's this whole context behind that photo that basically informs every day where I am, what am I doing, and how did I get here.
Yeah, that visual attachment that you had, or you have with that Huey, and it makes me think of the generations that come much later. There really isn't a whole lot to bind the younger generation to this previous culture. I mean, you left when you were what, 3?
3 years old, yeah.
3 years old, and you have this strong attachment to that image because you were inside of that helicopter, and now it's going overboard. And there's so much representation in what that even means. The work that you do today might be seeded. I mean, when I think about it, it's like, it has roots in the things that we are a part of even before we know that we're part of them, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I don't know sometimes whether I think, like my career, and like, again, working in a place like the NATO Archives and just in archives in general, in the field of archives, right? I mean, this is memory work, right? I work for memory institutions, right? I'm in the memory industry. And yet for me, when I see that photo, like I said, I'm only 3 years old. I see the photo. I'm told, like, I've been told through oral histories that yes, I was there. Like everything about that photo suggests my presence, outside of the frame of that photo. But because of my relative youth, I mean, I'm only 3 years old. I don't
Yeah.
have any actual concrete memories of it. And, I always walk around saying that it's my one great regret, right? And I tell the story of the escape so much because I reconstructed it. I've asked my parents, I've asked my family, I've asked everybody. I've done research, like trying to find, the evidence and the facts around the landing, and the day, and trying to understand the day and everything like that, because I don't have that memory. I'm reconstructing it, and that gap. It's just like there's a gap that I feel like like I'm wanting to fill, right? And sometimes I kind of think, whether it's some kind of cosmic destiny or a happy
Yeah.
accident or whatever, but my eventual, let's say, place, like like I get what I do, what I, and even informed by my interests, my take on a lot of things, that kind of historical context bit, right? It sometimes feels like, that's kind of what I'm trying to do. I've been driven to do this, like to fill in these gaps, fill in this hole, right? There's a hole that I want to make, or at least make understandable to myself, right? It's like this lifelong quest, you know, because this monumental event happened and I don't have any memory of it.
Right. Right. Speaking of reconstruction, what did your father do after he arrived in Calgary?
Yeah. So what happened was, when we landed in the U.S., we were basically at Camp Pendleton, and I think you've even got a personal history to that. And you mentioned that you were a production assistant on Tony Bouis's film about Camp Pendleton. So you've probably had some, you've done your own research, I think, on Camp Pendleton, right? And same with me. I mean, like I have memories of Camp Pendleton, but I always question let's say the
Right.
reality,
And I was
right? Because I
stationed there
see,
for about a month too.
okay. So, I mean, I have photos. I have photos of us there. I hear the stories. And again, the memories that play in my head, these movies that I have in my head about it, again, whether they're actual or
Right.
imagined is always going to be contested. But I couldn't have, we stayed there for several months waiting to be relocated. And how we ended up being in Canada was that my mother, she had a sister who was, her sister actually was living in Canada at the time. She was married to a Vietnamese man who had been educated in the French system, and he had been teaching in, let's say, francophone countries. So at first he was I think he was in African Zaire, and then he ended up teaching in Quebec. He was in Trois-Rivières. And so there was a link there. They're like, oh, okay, during the whole relocation process, they're like, oh, okay, you've got family in Canada, and Canada was, again, open to receiving refugees at the time. And that just seemed like, well, if you have a family link there, then that might be, that might be an easy kind of base to kind of, start your new life type of thing. But none of us spoke French well enough to live in Quebec. But Canada was still the place to go. And I think my father had expressed, let's say, some disillusionment or discontentment about how, like how it all fell down with the Americans at the end following 1973. And, just the general attitude, at least from a political perspective. And so he didn't feel comfortable staying in the States. He was happy to take us to Canada. So, instead of, we had my mother's brothers with us, and they neither spoke English nor French very well. So we ended up basically, instead of going to Quebec, we went to Regina, Saskatchewan, which is smack in the middle of Canada. And there's not much there, right? So it was pretty much, let's say, a civil repopulation kind of, kind of project, right? And so we ended up going there, and we got welcomed by a church group. I remember being welcomed as, the new members of the community. Very nice people, kind of welcomed us, put clothes on us, sheltered us, and kind of helped us get going. But very quickly, I think my father noticed that there wasn't a lot of opportunities other than, let's say, secondary or tertiary kind of industry. And so with his helicopter network, of a lot of his buddies, he ended up finding out that, several of them had found their way to Calgary. And Calgary, Alberta, at that time and still is a very natural resource kind of focused industrial town. And that's, it was easy to bring helicopter pilots there because they would need to supply supplies or other things to remote locations where the mines were up north. And so it sounded, okay, well, that sounds fine to me. Let's try this. Sounds like there's more opportunity there than there is here. So after 3 months, we all moved out west to Calgary. And so once he was in Calgary, he realized that, some of these helicopter jobs, they're, they're pretty long hours and they take me away from my family. And I can't really leave my family because, they can't really get on by themselves.
Right.
And I don't really feel like living in a remote community up north where there's nothing, right? Even though the pay would be good. And I think also he also realized that given his training, he, flying helicopters, even in the theater of war, he was not trained to fly in harsh environments like northern Canada, right, where it's very cold, and so the physics are different, right? Like understanding the weather, the conditions and its effect on the blades, and like how you handle that stuff. So he was just like, no, this isn't the right decision to make. So we still settled in Calgary. He ended up working night jobs and then going to school at the same time, and then he ended up getting a degree in geophysics.
Wow.
And then made his way up, and then ended up working in that industry again, in the natural resource industry. So yeah, geophysics was his area of study. And meanwhile, my mother was working, retail jobs and teaching. She ended up getting into teaching. But one of the things that my parents did in Vietnam in Calgary, was that there was quite a large collection of Vietnamese that started to come to that were in Calgary, and so they ended up playing a large role in the Calgary Vietnamese Association. And so, bringing together the community, and my father played much more of that kind of administrative, kind of like a, leader. He was a captain of a squadron, so he was used to leading or being seen to lead, or expected to lead, groups of people, right? And he had some kind of, he had the understanding of how to do that. And so a lot, having places for, Vietnamese to gather, to celebrate, our traditions, like Tết, like the New Year's. That was an important festival, right? I remember early on we would celebrate it. We were able to rent it, like a gym in a local high school on the weekend, and then that's where we would have the variety shows, right, where you're singing and eating and comedy sketches and all that stuff, just to celebrate. And again, it was a way, especially for, again, if you've just been uprooted and you're living in a place where you have no idea what the hell's going on, it's easy to get together and do something that reminds you of home, and reminds you of who you are, right? So a lot of my childhood memories are rooted in these experiences, right? Like not really understanding, but being a part of it, being in the middle of the action, because my parents were so involved in it. My father on the, if you want to call it, the administrative end, and my mother on the social graces end, right? She was a singer, she was a performer. And so they worked really well together, both in front of the stage and behind the stage. So, I mean, like, I was always surrounded, I was always in the meetings, we were brought to meetings, we were brought to rehearsals.
Yeah.
And so we were really in the thick of, this kind of growing Vietnamese community. Right. Well, and it was a young community, right? I mean, if you think about it, many of them probably they're in the mid 20s to, this is the 25 to 35 age range,
right?
With again a couple seniors, but I think that would be the core, right? And so some people are like they need to help looking for jobs, they need to find trying to settle, find a new house, lots of things, right? So coming together, I think, and forming this association and then legitimizing it with, with its official connections to the city, right, where we get funding from the city and being recognized by the city as an official group that, again, by the time the city officially recognized our Tet celebrations as something, worthwhile, not only to, to give grants to or funds to, but also have, political leaders come and kind of, give it its blessing.
This experience that you have sounds very different from the Vietnamese American experience. Maybe it's just because I haven't talked to enough people, but I don't recall the American communities sort of getting that actively behind these growing Vietnamese communities throughout the United States.
It's interesting that you say that because, like having where I'm actually, I've been living in Europe now for the last 12 years. Since I arrived in 2009. And one of the, in France, for example, especially in Paris, there's a substantial Vietnamese population, right? I mean, like it's been historic. It's always been there. But what's interesting that I found is that, similar to what you're saying, that experience doesn't exist either there. And I was told that by, several Vietnamese people, generation older than I am.
Yeah.
Like they actually said, Vietnamese community, there's no such thing here, right? Not in that way, not in the way, for example, that I experienced, right? And that's one of the, and then, that kind of woke myself up to, and again, I think it speaks to your question, what does it mean to be Vietnamese? Well, what does it mean to be Vietnamese for me means something completely different.
Totally.
In terms of somebody, my age, even growing up in, someplace like Paris or someplace like, San Jose or something like that, right? I feel very fortunate in the sense that how I grew up and the circumstances of my upbringing, in terms of like not being isolated, being, my parents being very active in bringing people together and helping people. And seeing how, years later, how a lot of that work, a lot of that groundwork that they
paid
put
off,
and all the time, the blood, sweat, and tears that they put in, has, let's say, how it's paid forward for them years later in their life, right? It's to see that living example of wow, like they're, like they actually, they did something about it, and it wasn't for them, but it has given back to them, as and in their senior years, right? That help that they gave people, because I remember this revolving door of constant, like people meeting new people, friends. I thought I had the biggest family in the world, right? Because of the way we refer to, people, like the Chu and the Ko, and like I always thought that these were my uncles, like my actual uncles and aunts that I was meeting. Whereas no, they were just people coming into our lives, getting started and then moving onwards and then kind of growing on their own. And seeing them come back to say and show their gratitude to my parents has been extremely eye-opening and informing, and it has certainly had a great effect on both my brother and I. There's no question.
As you were growing up in Calgary, what did you envision yourself becoming?
You got me. I mean, I'll be completely honest. I mean, I had no idea. I had never had any idea about what I wanted to do. I knew what I was good at, in the sense that I knew what I was able to, I was acknowledged as being, good at math, like the classic, Tiger example, right? Like, he's, like good at math, good at physics. He's going to be one of those, like the path that, it was almost like that classic first wave immigrant kind of, kind of path, right? Like, you're going to be a doctor, lawyer, engineer type of thing, right? And so I honestly didn't know what I wanted to be, right? I was just happy being. And when the time came to actually kind of, take the next step, right? So, okay, high school's over. What next? Oh, well, I got to study to be something now, as opposed to just study. Okay, so I had no idea. And so my father had guided me towards what seemed to be a good idea, which was engineering, because it matched what my grades, if you want, right? I was able to do that, even though my interests were much more in the kind of arts and humanities and the social sciences, right? But it was hard for me to understand, like, oh, this is what I like to do versus what I have to study, right? I hadn't made that connection yet, that you could actually do both, right? I thought one was pleasure, one was work, right? And I didn't
Yeah.
realize that one could professionalize one's pleasures.
But I think in those days, in the generations of yours, I'm a little bit behind you, but well, probably the same generation, where we were worried about surviving. We really were worried about making the money, and our parents were, and we didn't. I think we were so close to that worry and that sort of that pressure that we didn't think that we could do professions outside of the basics.
I think so. I agree with that. I mean, I think part of, and I think it still permeates, like a lot of my parents' thinking, right? It's just like, oh, you got to save, so, you always got to plan. Their experiences, especially, basically at our age, was constantly thinking about the future of their children, because it was always in question, right? Because they were still constantly kind of building and looking out for us, right? And making sure, like, that's part of what being, if you want to call it Vietnamese, is all about, right? That this Vietnamese experience that we have, that we have been historically shaped by, right? It's just kind of like building towards the future.
And it's also part of being on the outside of the community, on the outside of mainstream, that you're like, because if you think about our kids now, it doesn't matter if they're in Europe, for you especially, if they're in Europe, or if they're in, my kids are half Taiwanese, half Vietnamese. If they're in Taiwan, Vietnam, somewhere in Europe or Canada, Australia, I think my kids will be able to go anywhere now, because they're on the inside of wherever they need to go. They're part of, this English speaking body. So they're inside, they're not left on the outside. So you're not worried that they're going to survive. Whereas I think our parents were so on the outside coming to these new countries that they had a lot of worry about it, right?
Oh, for sure, for sure. And I think there's still there, and I think it's still always there, right? I mean, like, okay, even if I move to Europe and they're like, okay, still worry, right? Like, oh, is everything okay? Are you fitting in, right? I mean, like that question of fitting in, whether you are going to blend in or melt in, or how are you going to do it, right? I mean, I think they had a harder time. There's no question. I believe that our parents' generation had a harder time kind of coming in, because of the circumstances, the immediate circumstances of their existence and their arrival, right? Like, oh, you're one of them boat people, right?
Yeah.
You came here that way, right? You're part of the war, right? And for me, growing up, and especially I think our generation, growing up to be, growing up with other, like always being, outside of our family. This is where this business of being outside, always having told what being Vietnamese was through popular culture, right? As especially American popular culture was making sense of everything about their relationship with Vietnam, how we would see it, either in the movies or on TV or in books. It was just like they're Americans coming to terms. And that's the dominant narrative that we've always kind of had to deal with, right? I remember growing up, and any Vietnam War film that came up, I'd look to my dad and he's like, like that's their perspective, right? Like, and again, it's always, and it's like, I remember his big question: when is there ever going to be, the perspective, a film that's just going to show our perspective? And for me, I was like, okay, when I think back about it, what does he mean by our? Who is our, right? Does he mean his perspective? Does he mean South Vietnam's perspective? Does he mean the people who, the Viet Cong, the people who left, and are looking back at it, or the people who stayed and are looking out, or the winners, the ones who decided to rename, I was born in a city that, officially doesn't exist, even though it still exists in the minds and the language of everybody who, it's called Ho Chi Minh City, but everyone still calls it Saigon. And I'm curious to see at what point is it no longer going to be called Saigon.
Nick, can I interrupt you?
Mm-hmm.
I had a conversation just recently about that very thing, Nick. Who are we supposed to root for when there's a country called Vietnam that goes to the World Cup and wins it, or just gets into semifinals. What flag do we root for now?
Oh, for sure. I mean, like, there's again, and then I think this goes back to your question about what does it mean to be Vietnamese, right? I mean, like, is it, what does it mean to be Vietnamese, like in terms of a, like, say, a political identity or an historical identity, or, or just even like a cultural identity? I mean, like, it's an extremely complex question. And I think it's even more complex, especially for us, right? It may be less complex for, let's say, people who are living now, right? Like my cousins who were born after the war, who have been born and raised and living in, like, just outside of Hanoi in a city called Tai Binh. I think their identity is pretty straightforward.
It's set,
right?
yeah.
No question. The past is the past, and they don't really, it's just like it's before them, right? It's one of the interesting things whenever I've gone back, like, and I've even asked my father because, there were moments where, because, like, again, given his personal history, he was born in the North, but he was raised in the South. He was separated from his family, his birth family, and the rest of his family, they were foot soldiers, for North, the North Vietnamese Army, and he's a pilot for the South Vietnamese Army, right? So I was like, well, when you finally get together, how do you reconcile this stuff? And he's like, well, we don't talk politics. What's the point? Like, what's the point of dredging that stuff up, right? We're family, right? And it's the elephant in the room. But after everything that's happened, we now find ourselves face to face after all this time. Let's just focus on what we've lost, as opposed to, fighting battles that have already been fought, right? So it took me a while to understand that, because it's like, but I'd always be like, but, because we always think about things like wars in terms of winners and losers, right? But, there's an argument to say that, well, in this war, really, like, politically, fine, there was a winner, but what did it cost families, right? Every family lost in if you want to talk about a certain kind of way. So how does, let's figure out, and I think what my father was trying to get at it was like, let's try to heal stuff, right? I mean, like, there's no point, like, getting into these endless political arguments that really,
well, if I was to ask you that, I wanted I know it's not this cut and this dry and clear, and if I wanted an instruction manual for my children to root for a team that's going to go to the World Cup, what do we say? At this point in our history, parents like you and me, what do we say to our children?
Yeah, good. Like, home. I think for people like us, home. We have several homes, several ideas of home, right? Who we root for, right? I mean, like, like I'd say, for example, here's a good example. My kids, they have Canadian citizenship, they have French citizenship, but they're born and raised in Belgium, right? When it comes to the World Cup, and when it comes to the football tournament, especially that's going on right now, the Euro Cup, they're Belgian fans. No problem. Like, it's, and I don't have, that's not coming anything from me. That's their choice, right?
Yeah.
And because it's their world, right? And one of the things I've noticed, and I think about being a father, and perhaps you'll see it, like you've experienced it to some degree, is there's like, as they grow up and, they start to, their world is what they construct, right? And what they want to add to it is based on their curiosity, right? And that's pretty much what happened to me. Like, I have this, like, I came from a world that no longer exists. I'm trying to reconstruct it in my own way, right? Like, with my constant research and revisitations of the past, right? It's just kind of like, this is a world that has vanished. The web has, the internet has certainly facilitated, the circulation of, like, tons and tons of fantastic images of, a Vietnam that is lost to us, that we never knew, right? That this is the Vietnam of our parents, of our grandparents, right? We have that ability to look back and see, like, wow, this, and in a certain kind of way, we have the knowledge to actually put it into context, right? Like, yes, this was a time and a place. This is how our parents, the previous generations grew up. This is what we left. This is what they built. This is what's happened since, right? We have, being diasporic, we have this kind of globalized, detached view of things. And this is what I think this gets to some of the points you're getting on being outside of it. We're outside of it. We have, and being outside of it, you have that privilege, if you want to take advantage of it, you have that privileged perspective of being critically detached, to be able to get a more global sense, and therefore make things a lot more complex as opposed to binaristic, winners or losers, it makes things more complicated, right? And therefore more rich, right? And so it's not easy to answer some of these questions. I think it becomes a lifelong conversation, a lifelong dialogue, right? That's certainly the case for me, right? I mean, like, I haven't stopped, learning or asking about, the context of that photo, right? What led to it, right? And the light, and the universes that are linked because of that, right? That photo, the photo of that helicopter points to a past, but it also, led to a future, right? And for me, that has, that puts me in terms of, like, to answer your question, what does it mean to be Vietnamese? I mean, like, it encompasses all of that.
Yeah.
I'm incredibly proud to be Vietnamese, right? Because, it's not just about, I come from a certain kind of, I come from a country, that's in Southeast Asia, and, they've beaten the Americans, they've beaten the French, et cetera, and, not all, kind of falling into that line. This is, it's more like, I come from a country that's so full of questions, again, I can dive into it, and everywhere I go, it comes, that history stays with me, that cultural and historical identity, it goes with me wherever I go. That's
Follows you, yeah.
I literally wear it, right? And so, again, being in places, growing up where I have, working in places that I have, that I do, I'm a very small minority. I'm always, like, the one standing out, right? So it took me a while to be comfortable with that, right? Because our parents, let's say, that mentality we grew up with, like, look, don't stand out, keep a low profile, work hard, and just kind of slip through the radar, right? You don't want to be noticed, right? Because if you're noticed, then, I remember being picked on for my difference, right? And so it's taken a while to not only embrace that difference, right? And, like I said, and wear it now, right? It's like, no, everything that's happened to me, and like, again, talking with you about, and answering your questions about my upbringing, my experiences and everything like that, to get me to where I am, right? I mean, like, I look at where I am compared to where, and looking back to how I started and where we started to where I am, that's something I want to make sure my kids know. You want to talk about a manual? It's just kind of like, please, boys, in terms of my children, this, think about where like, as you're constructing your world, as you move forward, you're eventually going to ask, how did I get here? There's a rich history of how you got here. And I want to be prepared to have that conversation with them when they start asking that question, because it's not, like, it's not as cut and dry, right? And again, thanks to the intense documentation that we have available at our fingertips at this point in time in history, right? They can actually absorb a lot more, and then when they, the time comes to actually experience it, right? Whether it be through oral history, stories being told to them by my grandparents or me, or things that have been written down, things that they studied, and then finally going back and experiencing what it's like to be in, let's say, Vietnam, tracing the footprints in the sand of not only me and the journey that I made to understand myself through my parents and everything like that. So then they can actually see, oh, this is kind of, for them, this is where it all started. It starts there for them, right? For me, I'm proud to say that it started there.
Yeah.
Right? Because in this little country that's been the battleground for a lot of superpowers to basically wage their kind of wars, in that country, in this little, like, this is where we come from, we've been a pawn in a lot of geopolitical struggles, especially in the 20th century, right? And we come out of it, and we've come out of it as individuals, right? And that's the legacy that we bear, right? There's scars we carry those kinds of scars all over the place, and those scars tell stories. Each scar is a story, right? It's a trace. So how do we make sense of that? How do we, instead of being, I think some of our parents' generations, those scars are very traumatic, right? And so it's very hard for them to talk about sometimes, right? Because it's so firsthand. But because we have that, we're the children and we have that detachment, right? We can have that ability to, kind of engage with it with less trauma, let's say, and then try to help, either help them through it or at least come to terms with it ourselves.
Yeah. Nick, what you got into the electrical engineering field from that point to working at the NATO Archives? What was your journey?
So my undergraduate degree, I did my undergraduate in electrical engineering at Queen's University, Kingston, Ontario. That was a slog. Okay, it wasn't the easiest. It wasn't the easiest degree for me. It was very humbling, in the sense that here was a path that was chosen for me, or literally chosen for me, because I didn't know what else to do. That was based on the fact, the idea that I would benefit, my skills, and everything that I'd worked on would pave the way for me to this kind of career.
Right.
Well, I failed spectacularly. Right. It was extremely difficult for me. And to the point where I started questioning, again, all those, a lot of the doubts that we, already carry with us, and the pressure that, like we have, that's, we didn't come all this way for you to fail,
Yeah.
we didn't escape a war only for you to, that kind of stuff. So, I survived the engineering degree. I was able to find work in the field, right? But I always kind of knew that, this is not necessarily my cup of tea, right? And I had mentioned before that there were things that I liked to do, like if you want, some people would call them hobbies, right? But there were things that I was really drawn towards, right? That I didn't realize that one could study academically, right? So the major one for me, and I'm very, very interested, I've always been interested in visual narrative, right? So, I would read when I was growing up, I read a lot of comics and I watched a lot of films. My father was a cinephile, and he always had films lying around the house, right? He was one of those early adopters of home cinema technology. So when we arrived in Calgary, he had an 8mm camera. He was shooting the home movies. We were, and at that time, libraries were renting 8mm films to bring home, and you can watch and project on a screen, right? Pre-VHS. Right. And then when VHS and Betamax came, we had those in our house. So I was always, very early on, I had the ability to, and that habit of rewatching films, and in the habit of rewatching films, you kind of, start to get to know them. You can add, then you start picking apart things, differences, picking out scenes, favorite scenes, describing them, talking about them. In other words, a kind of proto-film studies kind of approach. Right. And so, I ended up reading a lot. I'd go to the library a lot and I'd read a lot. Oh, there are film books here. And so I would spend a lot of time reading about films as well. And then, one of the things about, growing up in Calgary in the Chinatown, and I think this was the case in almost every Chinatown in the States, you had a great video store that had all the videos from like Hong Kong. There was always something about the Chinatown video stores that just had the most amazing selection of films. They were always on top of things, right? It was like before Blockbuster came along, you just go rent movies in Chinatown. Yeah. And so, like Chinatown we would hang, it became like that kind of centralized space for so many of us to eat, to socialize, And then obviously then to rent movies, right? And so I remember the first time I'd go to Chinatown with my father, and I went into a video store, and it blew my mind. I'm like, oh my God, there's so many, you know. And then there was even that, you know, that kind of forbidden area, right, with the beads, right, where it's just like, okay, you don't go there. I'm like, okay, well, what's behind there? I can't wait to find out what's behind there. But, you know, that has always stuck with me, right? And so many times, you know, by the time we got to a certain age, like I had mentioned that my parents were very involved with the Vietnamese community. They didn't need to take us to meetings anymore, right? My grandmother, whom had arrived from Vietnam, you know, my parents sponsored her to come to live in Canada with us after my grandfather died. My maternal grandfather died in Vietnam, so she came to live with us, and so she ended up staying with us, as is the way, you know, that's just the way it is, right? So she ended up, you know, so that freed my parents to do what they needed without having to take us anymore. And so that's what we would do. My brother and I, we would watch these movies all the time. My father, you know, had learned very quickly how to tape movies, like, so transferring, you know, a rental into, you know, a blank tape. And we had Star Wars very early on, for example. My brother and I memorized that film like to death, you know.
Wow.
So that, you know, film has always been a major part of my life. And you know, my father being a specific type of cinephile, right? I mean, like he was a very much 1950s, early 1960s Hollywood cinema kind of fan, right? And I think a lot of it had to do with his, you know, seeing a lot of these stars, especially, you know, like these younger actors, these younger method actors coming, you know, becoming more popular, like the James Deans, the Montgomery Clifts, the Marlon Brandos, the Warren Beatties, right? Like there's those actors and the films that they were in really kind of marked my father. And so we had those films too, right? And a lot of films around those eras. So I was introduced to classical Hollywood cinema very early on, right? I loved black and white films, and then staying up late at night, you know, you get those late night movies again, old movies again. So I would just eat that stuff up. But again, I never understood it as something that you could study. So it was only when I went to my undergrad and I went to a school, Queen's University, that I was introduced to friends, and they were taking film studies. And I was like, you can take this. This is, you know, because there wasn't, in Calgary at the university, there wasn't a film studies program there. So it never entered my mind. So when I went there, and then it just happened to be that Queen's University was the first university in Canada to open up a film school in the late 70s.
Wow.
So I was just like, oh, this is a thing, you know, and I was fascinated by it. So my friends would tell me about what they were studying, and I was like, wow, I really wish I knew about this, right? But I've already gone on a certain kind of path. But because that path ended up, you know, leading me to repeat a lot of courses, I had, by the time a 4-year degree, you know, a 4-year degree turned into a 6-year degree. And so I had a lot of, let's say, I had a lot in the courses that I had to repeat. I had some extra courses to fill in since I was paying full tuition. So I was like, well, I'm going to take some film courses then. I'm going to take advantage of this situation and take some film courses. And the film courses that I took really kind of like, you know, you can see the light bulb go off in my head. Right, it's just film studies at Queen's at that time really was focused on theory and history, not so much production, but theory, history, criticism. You know, and so in other words, ways of seeing the world, you know, as negotiated through film, and that blew my mind. I was just like, this is what I want to do. I love the idea of seeing the world in this way. You know, putting it in, you know, into a kind of historical, cultural, social, political context. Right. So that was always in the back of my mind. When I worked in the engineering field for 3 years, I realized that very quickly my knowledge had an expiry date. You know, like that field, you constantly need to renew yourself.
Yeah.
And you know, having a lot of friends who were in that field, renewing that knowledge is a pleasure to them. It wasn't to me. It was labor. And I realized that no, if I stayed in this field, I was going to either stagnate or get fired very quickly and be extremely unemployable. But the film thing had always stuck in my head, and so I literally went back to my film professors in my undergrad. You know, I called them up. I had a holiday one day. I called them up and I said, I had a meeting with them. I was like, look, I want to do what you do. I just don't know how to do it. You know, can you give me some tips? And it just, again, there's a lot of synchronicity and luck in my life. It just happened to be at that moment that the city that I was living in, Ottawa, Ontario, he had just said that, oh, well, the university that in Ottawa, they've just opened up the second master's degree program in the country. You should check it out, right? And so, I started to do some inquiries, and then through a network of coincidences, again, my love of comics led me to befriend several people who were doing comic studies, doing their PhDs in comics, and they just happened to have got, they were familiar with the school and the professors, and this film school in Ottawa. So through that network, I was able to kind of meet the supervisors there, and they, had a meeting with them, and, they encouraged me to apply, and I got in, and I was shocked because I was like, well, look, I don't have any background other than a couple of courses,
So
I'm working in the field.
From the electrical engineering background to going
Film
to
studies.
school, did you ever work in the field of electrical engineering?
Yeah, I worked 3 years as a test engineer. So, and again, I worked for 3 years for a company called Die4 Systems, and their niche market was building single board computers for ruggedized environments. So that meant really harsh environments like extreme temperatures, extreme humidities. So, a lot of military applications, right?
Yeah. So you go back to school to get into a film program?
Yeah.
Get a
And
master's?
I did that, and I ended up getting a master's degree in film studies, because what I felt like doing is that I wanted to teach film, right? I loved it so much that I wanted to share, like what I had learned, and kind of, I really admired I was lucky enough to have really excellent professors that opened my eyes, and that feeling of like sharing that perspective and illuminating, let's say, things that you think that you knew, but asking you to see it in a different way, that was really attractive to me. And that's something that, like, I kind of did that already in a certain kind of sense. So to see it done in that context was like, wow, I think this is a nice marriage. So that led me to teach film studies for several years at the university as well. After I got my master's degree, I ended up teaching there. But one of the kind of, let's say, byproducts of doing my master's in film studies was that I got into film preservation. There was one of the lecturers was a guest speaker who worked at the National Archives of Canada in the film preservation lab. He and I hit it off. He ended up giving me a student contract at the National Archives film lab, and there they were all about restoring films, like actual film, like film, appraising them, evaluating them, preparing them, splicing, like I learned how to splice, and just getting a basic understanding of film preservation. And that was really, a really excellent experience. And, to be able to handle film, like the material aspect of film, understanding how it's duplicated, and preserved and everything like that, right? So that's how I got into archives, right? I got into the archives because of film preservation. And when I was in the film preservation, after several years as working as a film conservator, there was openings in government records in the archives section. And so a friend of mine really encouraged me to go. And I was like, well, I don't have any background in this stuff, but, I don't have anything to lose. I applied. I succeeded in the competition, and I ended up being a government records archivist. And one of the reasons why I got hired into that area, because I was like, I don't have any idea, but I was because I never had any experience with government records. But one of the things that they understood from my interview was that I understood cultural production, right? Because of my film studies background and my interest in all that stuff. And so a lot of the government agencies that I became responsible for in terms of my portfolio were the cultural production agencies. So, agencies that gave grants to films, to film production, or, like the Television Broadcasting Corporation, that kind of field, right? So that was how I ended up getting into the government records archives. And then through the government records, that's how I ended up getting into NATO. Because it was at my time in the National Archives, it's called Library and Archives of Canada, working as a government records archivist, that again, I was encouraged to apply for this opening in the NATO Archives. I was like, again, I don't have any, I'm the first one to actually, kind of dissuade people who are encouraging me to do something, to go for this, because I'm like, I don't have any background in political military, records, but I still apply. I said, oh, well, what do I got to lose? If I get to the competition, at least I get a free trip to Europe. Like, that's how I was thinking, right? But I ended up getting the job, and so that's been the adventure since.
Wow. And when you say it's a competition, what did you mean by that?
So when I say a competition, it's like there's a want ad, right? I mean, like there's a job announcement that's circulated out, right? And international organizations do this all the time, right? They open it up to the general public, right? It circulates on listservs. If you're connected to, or universities or anything like that, these announcements get out there. It's even posted on the website, career opportunities. And so, in that sense, like I applied, and then it goes through, again, you literally go through a competition, right? So it's like, okay, first, you go through the pre-screening process, then there's a short list, and then there's a final list, right? And you're always kind of being evaluated at every stage, right? So interviewing, writing exams, language tests. What's your language proficiency? In the case of NATO, English and French are the official languages of business. So they want to see exactly, are you proficient in English? And if you are, then how proficient are you in French? And then basically they tally up your score, and then it's balanced, then it's kind of measured off against the other candidates that made it to the final cut. And then a decision is made in terms of, okay, which of all these candidates, which one is the best fit? So that's what I mean by competition.
Got it. And how many positions were open for that job that you submitted for?
So what was, again, I'm blessed with some kind of cosmic luck in terms of, by the time I arrive on these things, the positions that I applied for were brand new, right? They had just opened up because, to give you a little history, this is around 2005, 2006, actually, 2006, 2007 that I applied for this stuff, this job. February 2007, that's it. That was when I submitted my application. The NATO Archives is inaugurated in 1999. Okay, and so it's a brand new, let's say, service within the organization, and so it takes a little bit of time to, because it's a bureaucracy, things take a long time. So it took a while for, okay, there's the announcement of the service, and then we got to build the service, right? So they brought in an archivist who basically started the work and then, laid the foundation, and then started to create, a team that needed, like if this is the function of the archives, it requires to be staffed in this way, and it needs teams, and there's going to be units to do this work. And so a new unit was created, and that was the unit that included my position. So I was the first one to occupy that position. So I applied in 2007, and I arrived in 2009. And again, it was an archives assistant role. And so it was basically, again, just kind of organizing the archives, because it was, again, it needed to be, it needed to have modernized, like a modern archives approach to the collection, as opposed to just kind of like dumping stuff in and just organizing them by subject, right? And, like there's an archival science, right? And there's archival theories and ways of doing things that, especially at an international level, so that, there's an international standard, so that, people, researchers can have access to it, right? And so it was during this position, during my work there, that a new archivist came in, and she was very attentive to the accessibility issue of archives. How to make the archives accessible, and accessible means not only just making sure that they're preserved properly, but letting people know that they can research them, they can use them, right? And so outreach, she put an emphasis which hadn't been there before to a certain kind of degree, on a regular degree, on outreach activities related to what the archives was doing. And so I ended up getting involved in a lot of those projects, like finding ways, like exhibition work, finding ways to highlight, the work that we were doing in the archives and the records that we were processing and making available to researchers, letting people know, like, hey, these are now ready for you to come and study and to, like, interpret in your own way, right? And so, you know, I basically started doing 2 exhibitions a year, right? And usually they're internal because we wanted to raise the profile of the archives and the organization, because most people, when they think of archives, it's not really the most positive or dynamic idea, right? And so what we wanted to do was kind of change people's perspectives, change people's ideas, that, no, it is actually quite a dynamic, it's not a static kind of, like, dusty to cobwebs, find, the eventual treasure, like you might find the lost Ark of the Covenant in a whole bunch of boxes down in the basement type thing. Right. But, like, there's stuff here that, and again, it's always been my philosophy, right, is that, okay, well, here's a whole bunch of information. So what's the context around that information? What makes it interesting, right? How do we make this stuff interesting? Well, let's illuminate the context, right? So then by providing a context, it allows, it allows an entryway to understand its relationships, right? Not only to the context, but to other documents or things outside of that context.
Right.
And so at least it becomes at least a foundation to build certain systems of knowledge around. So that's always been my approach.
So when you say exhibition, I think, when I think of archives, I just think of these rooms filled with filing cabinets of information. But exhibition, that requires some sort of proactive thought, right? To organize like an event and get the word out. And exhibitions typically mean that there are things that you have to curate and put out into the public so they can sort of think about the contextual positioning between imagery. So how do you break that down?
Yeah, those are good questions. I mean, like, because I think they really go at the heart of the nature of the work, right? Because it is a challenge, right? I mean, like, one of the things to keep in mind that, is like an archives exhibition is very different from a museum exhibition, right? Like,
right.
You don't, like, highlighting documents, and putting them in display cases is not the most interesting thing, right? Unless it's, like one of the most important documents, like the Constitution, for example, right? That's something else, right? That is a rare kind of example, right? Most archives is all about, like, again, the nature of the documents means that, like, they're long documents, right? They're several documents. You don't want to put pages of a report, on display. It just doesn't make sense, right? You just might as well give people the report instead of, and so the notion of, let's say, presenting originals the way you would in a museum, right? Like, well, here's the original document, right? Like, that aura of its originality, of its novelty, doesn't even cross my mind in an archives exhibit, unless it is that one piece of, like a monumental, kind of document, like,
right.
Okay, here is the document that appoints, Dwight D. Eisenhower as the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, the first one. Okay, that's a nice big deal one. Okay, fine. But, in terms of how we go about, curating the exhibition and figuring it out, well, a lot, the main, let's say, impetus behind the exhibition is to promote the disclosure activity, right? So it's like, okay, recent files have been declassified and publicly disclosed, as at the request of a certain nation, right? So I'll give an example. In this case, I'll talk about Poland. They were very proactive in making a request for declassification and public disclosure about records that were related to the declaration of martial law in 1981. Right? For them, it was a very it's an important historical moment in their national history. And so they weren't obviously they weren't members of NATO at the time. And so a lot of this information is a mystery to them. And so they want to learn more about it. And so now that they're members, they have the ability to go in and make that request. And in making that request, they can actually go through some of the documents and then select which ones that they would like to declassify. And so we worked with the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs and their archives in this process of selecting documents, declassifying them. They identified a set of records. Okay, fine, we disclosed them. And then it became time to, okay, well, let's publicize the fact that this labor has been done. All right, well, what do the records say? Right, so I'd read through the records. I'm like, okay, there's a lot of reports about what's going on. It was again a moment when martial law was declared, and it was literally, citizens were arrested. Political, again, a lot of political figures like Walesa were thrown into jail. The solidarity movement, right? It was a cracking point in the country's history.
I have a question though. When you say their archives, these are archives that are kept by the NATO organization, right?
That's right. Yes.
Because it's not Polish archives, or this is stuff that NATO collected on Poland.
That's correct.
And it was classified for the longest time until that period.
That's right.
So what's the actual process of a country coming to NATO and saying, hey, we want to know what was written about us? And who would in Poland lobby for that?
Oh, I mean, those are all very good questions. And I think this even speaks to some of the things that we were talking about earlier, right? So in the example that I'm talking about, a country like Poland does have, as a member of NATO, they have the right to make these requests, and they're interested in it because, like I said, by revealing this part of their national history, it also reinforces their relationship with the alliance, their historical relationship with the alliance, and how they can carry it forward, and then at the same time look backwards at it. Here's, during this moment of national crisis, right? Here is how the Allied nations were thinking about us, reacting to what was going on, right? What was the thought process? What is the political analysis? What's the military analysis? Was there action? How are they dealing with this, right? Because they didn't know. They didn't know, and this becomes a way of illuminating their national past, and yet at the same time linking them to, the Allied organization. Right, because so then that history, even though it's again it's not from their eyes, it's from a different perspective, it opens up and enlarges the context of how they look at their historical moment, right? Because because NATO is again a group of allies, so the information is coming from multiple national perspectives, right? So some of the information that was disclosed, for example, were embassy reports, right? Because NATO as an entity, they're not on the ground in Poland, but for example, Canada had an embassy in Poland, France had an embassy in Poland, right? So those embassies were getting reports and sending them back to their capitals, and then the capitals would share. Part of being an alliance is that you share information, right, in an allied context, right? So because it's NATO, in a political military context, right? That kind of information sharing then becomes the basis for certain kinds of decisions. How are we going to react to this, right? This is not an attack on our alliance, right? But the alliance needs to be aware of this how are we going to handle this situation should it escalate, right? And in many cases, and this has been the case for many situations that for countries that have gone through let's say upheaval or turmoil, not at a national level, like Hungary or Poland or the Czech Republic especially, right? What ends up happening is like, well, NATO can't really do anything. They're not the world's policemen. They don't go in and correct this. That's an internal situation. But they stood ready. The alliance stood ready to welcome and deal with the situation of refugees. So people fleeing that situation, seeking political asylum and refuge in allied countries, and then having programs working with other international organizations like the Red Cross, right, to basically help people relocate, restart their lives, and again, this sounds, like, doesn't, you can see the parallels about with our experience, right? It's
Yeah.
just kind of like, here's something that happens where people are forced to flee, they have to rebuild their lives. you know an organization like NATO, again, that's their coordination. That's what a lot of the information that they're sharing ends up leading towards, right? These kind of humanitarian relief activities that, in lieu of, let's say, military response, they're going to treat it in the opposite sense, which is like, okay. And again, there are several instances where, again, welcoming refugees, political, whether especially at the political level, has been, let's say, a hallmark of NATO's activities, right?
I have
One that really hasn't been. And again, it's thanks to the disclosure of this information that this aspect of their activities has become more and more known, right?
Yeah, that's the thing I was going to ask you. I mean, okay, embassies all over the region is collecting reports, and how are they actively being brought in back to NATO to be archived? And then again, my question goes back to Poland as a government. There has to be a group of people that are lobbying for this declassification.
Mm-hmm.
How is this? What's the mechanics of all of this happening?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of it has to do with, again, things like transparency, accountability, right? Especially at that level, right? Those are, let's say, values that, like, large scale organizations and countries want to, kind of demonstrate, especially to their citizenry, right? That level of accountability. Part of it is, again, when you think about it too, and I think this touches upon something like, the questions that you answered, like with respect to the generational questions, like, well, what happened before, right? I mean, like, there are, working in an international organization like NATO, and being my age and seeing, let's say, the next generation of workers coming in, especially interns and stuff like that, when you realize that, a lot of these kids, and I don't mean to sound patronizing by calling them kids, but, they were all born after the Berlin Wall fell, after communism, that whole thing, yeah, that whole business about, the Iron Curtain and everything like that. They never grew up in that, they dealt with the aftermath of the fall of the wall, but they didn't, like, similar to our parents, right? They lived, under, like, there was this communist regime, this threat, that basically defined their lives, and then it was gone. And so what happens afterwards, right? And then they're growing up in an era where things changed extremely fast, right? From, years and years of living in this kind of regime, a tightly controlled regime, where all of a sudden there's freedom of movement, free market, things are coming in, like images of, again, this is that MTV generation where you're just getting these images of, like, a certain kind of, of fashion, of life, of culture, and everything, right? You want to be a part of it, right? But it's aspirational, right? And so, like, again, it's a very fast ramp, right? That they're all living through, right? I mean, like, when I'm interested in that, because, when I speak to, like, I guess, people of, the generation behind me, right? I'm very fascinated to kind of keep in mind the historical context of their age, and pointing out things like, like, again, you didn't grow up in that, you didn't grow up in that context, but your parents did. How do your parents talk to you about what they went through, right? Because it mirrors, in many ways, it parallels our experience, right?
Right.
How did you deal, how do you, living in an environment now where really the world is a much more open with much more opportunities for you than your parents ever had, how do you negotiate that? How do you reconcile that with your parents? How do your parents reconcile that with you, right? These are the same questions that we grew up with, being, Vietnamese of a certain time and place, right?
Yeah.
So I relate, like I find it interesting to relate to people in that context, right? Because even though our experiences are extremely different, we are, again, we're products, our countries are, and our histories are products of this, this massive, conflict, these two, these, warring ideologies that really defined a certain kind of life, and with history with a capital H, and how do we emerge from it? Right. And so that, that's a long way around to answer your question about the mechanisms and why a country like Poland would want to do something like this, right? It is to excavate the past. It is to find the relationship and to find a certain kind of meaning. And especially, like if you want to call it revisionist, or revisionist doesn't necessarily have to be negative or completely like, rewriting, but, like adding another layer, right? A layer that wasn't available to them at the time, which is that perspective of the Allied nations, right? They'd heard it from their perspective. Well, what is it? How does we fit into the larger, kind of global, kind of story, right? How does, and then what insights can we get out of that?
When you arrived at NATO, what was your first year? What was your day-to-day, routine? What was your job description?
Oh, I mean, I was hired to basically help take, I was in a collections management role, right? So here's, part of it was getting the archives into order, right? Because it needed to be reordered in the profession, using modern, professional archival methodology, right? Things had been archived in the, let's say in the popular sense of what archives means. In the same way, like for example, on your Gmail, you have the archive button. Archive just in that respect means, okay, I'm going to put it in a different place, and it's just going to stay there, right? I'm keeping it and not deleting it, and whether or not you actually go into the archive and then start, let's say, organizing it by folder and then by sender or whatever, that's up to you, right? That's what we had to do, right? We have to, like things had been saved, but not necessarily in a certain kind of order, right? They were saved in the order that they were used, as opposed to saved in an order that could be accessed later on. That made sense, right? So that's what, that's in a large part what the job of archives is, right? Is to organize a collection so that it has a certain kind, it respects, like how how the records were created, but also the relationship between the records, the chronology of it. I mean, like, it's an interesting question because, just think about how you archive your own photos,
Right.
or your own life, your own records, your tax records, for
Yeah.
example.
And
After
when I
7
think,
years, you don't need them; you throw them away,
yeah,
right?
and when I think of all of these records, I think there's photos, there's hard documents, there's digital documents that are coming in from my phone, my computer, from all over the. I can't imagine what the NATO archives look and feel like in the quote unquote the room that these things are being stored and organized.
Yeah, I mean, like any of the international organizations, right? I mean, like as I mentioned before, the act of archiving has always been there, right? I mean, like, records are created, meetings are had, decisions are made, the records of those decisions are made, action is taken, the records of those actions are taken, you know, those are the kinds of records, right? And they're created, they're circulated, and then they get saved, right? And the thing is, it's just kind of like, okay, here's project, we put everything in the project folder, and then it's saved, right? And then we archive it. And there's okay, it's not, we're done, project's over, we don't need it anymore. Here's everything, save it, right? That's, for the longest time, that's, a lot of people, and I'd say a lot of people think that's what archiving is, right? But we go, the modern archives is more about, okay, well, how, like, fine, that's the way it is. That's kind of like here's a folder and it's based on the subject. But how are we going to organize this in a way that, makes sense, that actually reveals how an organization actually conducts its work, right? So, I mean, like in many ways, this is like a lot of like NATO, the NATO archive is very much a corporate, it's very similar to a corporate archive, right? Just like,
Right.
what are the, like it's organized by business function, right? Like, so there's going to be a whole bunch of, like, if this is a way, it gives, a good a good, like archival organization will give you a good idea of how the organization works. And so the records then become, an indicative of exactly the output of the work of the organization. So a good archive, you'll look at it and you're like, oh, I have a good understanding of how this whole machine works, right? And so that's what, again, so archiving in that way, very much to what I was kind of saying in terms of my own personal project, is about reconstructing something, right? Reconstructing about how, the context of how something works, right? And then you can get into the granular details, right?
How
But
many
getting that structure is important.
how many people work in the NATO archives?
We're a small team. It's about 10 people, yeah.
And
But it's a huge job, and it gets bigger and bigger every day, right? Digital information is, like you said, the amount of information that you have on your phone compared to, like, think about how much is on your phone, and how, if you actually were to visualize that,
it's insane. Yeah.
It's insane. It's insane, right? So
Yeah. I cannot
and
imagine.
so given the large amount of activities that any organization, kind of does on a daily basis and on an annual basis, it's an insane amount of work. Like, archives is an insane amount of work, right? And people tend to think of archives as this action that you do at the end, as opposed to, no, I got to put a plan in place at the beginning.
Wow.
So that I'm prepared, right? So in many ways, like, for example, like what you're doing this project, I'd say, right? You are archiving memories, right? And you've had a certain kind of plan of, like, okay, well, I'm going to put all of these on my website, right? And each one of your podcasts is available and accessible for all of us to hear and listen to, right? And eventually you back them up. Probably they're not available only on the website.
Right.
You've got the original recordings, you've got the edited product that you put out, right? And you probably save it somewhere, right? Because and you probably had to think about that before, like, okay, this is how I got, because you got a massive amount of information. It didn't come, and this was a project, I think, that has, you had a plan, and the plan, part of it was, okay, what am I going to do with all this stuff? Well, you have a plan, right? I understand that you have a good, up to 2050 at least, and so you need to archive this stuff, right? Because you want it to be a living archive.
Correct.
Right. And so that plan was, I would argue that you had a plan, maybe rudimentary at first, at the beginning, but it was at least there. This is not something that at the end of it, you're like, oh, maybe I have to do something about all this stuff. You've organized all of your raw files into their own separate folders, and then so that it's easy to access for you when you need to get to do work, or you want to, like, go back and maybe revisit an old interview and re-edit it in a different way so that different aspects come out, things that weren't talked about, or re-editing it or remixing it in a different way so that the similar elements are being used with different elements to provide a different, to provide a completely different
Correct.
Review.
This idea of opening up the archives, or, as I understand it, there's a reading room that was constructed a few years ago. What is the purpose? Why would NATO want to open up? I mean, it's probably a very basic question, but I think I'm just going to have to ask it just so we have it on record. But why would NATO open up a reading room, or even have these documents open up to the public?
Well, okay, so, again, in 1999 is when the archives is formally opened. And it's a symbolic opening because it's the opening of its reading room on site at NATO headquarters, so that about 33,000 declassified and publicly disclosed documents were finally made available. They had gone through the entire process, and they were made available to researchers, military researchers, professors, academics, to finally and again, they were all linked to the origins of the organization. So, like, the 1949 onwards to, let's say, the first 10 years, 49 to 59. right? To give a glimpse at the understanding, because NATO, when you're for the longest time, and I think there's a big mystery. What is NATO? It's like, most people, when I tell them I work at NATO, they think like I work at MI5, right? I'm like, oh, there's espionage stuff, right? I'm like, well, no, it's much more banal than that, right? you know uh, it's an organization where it's an organization where diplomacy reigns, right? It's about
Right.
talking, it's about meeting, it's about figuring out solutions diplomatically, right? So what is so there's a lot of questions, and these early records really helped to give researchers an idea of how this, the birth of this process, how it all came to be, right? And the fact that this happens in 1999, right? It's just kind of like, all right, this is 10 years after the fall of the wall. NATO is, it was made basically as a kind of as a defense against the Soviet Union and communism. But okay, well, that ends in 1989, symbolically. And then there's a process for the next 10 years where that whole structure gets to be, the Soviet, the former Soviet Union starts to kind of completely redefine itself. And, within a NATO context, you had former adversaries becoming allies, right? So like former Warsaw Pact countries, like, again, Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic,
Right.
They end up joining NATO. They're the first ones to join, right? In 1999, right? So we're heading into, we're heading into the new millennium. 1999 is happening. Former adversaries are becoming allies. There's a rapid change going on. The old, there's a sense that, the NATO that was will continue to exist, but it's evolving into something else. So now's a good time to, and in many ways, it's just like, well, if old adversaries are turning into friends, we kind of won, right?
Right.
So it's less of an intense, there's a less of an intense shroud of secrecy about it, right? So, the discourse of transparency and accountability, responsible, that kind of discourse starts to dominate, especially international organizations, right? Being accountable to the people, right? And being open to history. So all of these forces kind of come into play, so that by the time, NATO declassifies and makes these available, and again, it symbolically makes it having a reading room on site, which invites non-NATO personnel to look at these documents for the first time on site, is a very powerful kind of like symbol or image of a security organization that's been historically shrouded in secrecy, right? And the espionage stuff, and how it's always been seen in the James Bond films or other films, right? It's all it's about spies, but it's spies exchanging information, right? Documents, like the top secret folder that they're hiding or taking photos of, and then spiriting it off and handing it off, right? It's always about the information, right? To have that all of a sudden become consultable, in a controlled space, right? So that business can continue. It is a security organization, at the end
Right.
of the day. But to be able to say, well, no, we're opening up, right? Part of it is trust building, so that we're not this big question mark, right? And I think as time goes by, it's important that an organization like NATO is transparent and accountable, right? So that there's less question, there's less, let's say, of the wrong questions that are being asked, as opposed to the better questions, right? Like, what are you doing to help, as opposed to what are you hiding, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. Is there so after the Cold War is over, is there a counterpart of NATO that exists as the other on the outside world? As if NATO is the 30 member state, is there a 30 member or 20 member state that exists outside of NATO?
So, I mean, yeah, during the Cold War, I mean, there was, it was kind of like, it was an easy kind of like classic movie pairing, right? You had NATO versus the Warsaw Pact, right? It was like the pay-per-view, to end all pay-per-views, right? Like, like when are these two going to go to war, right? What's the battleground, right? It made for a kind of easy us versus them narrative, right? And so when that story ended, when that grand historical narrative ended, and then it became, well, what do we do next, right? Like, how does NATO redefine itself when its other, basically dismantled itself, right? And I think this is a question that's been ongoing for the longest time, right? And you'll see it if you read the headlines even now in the latest at the latest summit. That NATO, the summit meeting of the heads of state and government that NATO just had, it is about defining what the new challenges are, right? New challengers, even too, right? The world changes. Like, the security landscape has changed, right? I mean, like I was talking about 1999, all of this was, there's a feeling of like, modernizing, friends becoming old enemies, becoming friends, new path forward. We're even starting to talk with Russia, new dialogues are happening, and then boom, 9/11 happens. Terrorism becomes the next, let's say other, if you want, right? And so that leads to different other, like other activities that end up, let's say it's where Afghanistan tends to dominate a lot of NATO's activities, right? Terrorism, especially. And then you had the ISIS thing, and so on and so forth, right? Terrorism has been a big, let's say, stain on the globe for a long time, right? And so adjusting to, like, again, and one of the ways that, we talk about terrorism is that it's stateless. It's not like 30 terrorist nations getting together, right?
Right.
It's just kind of like, okay, well, it's just this, like how do you engage with this, right? It kind of changes the rules of the game, right? So there's a, like, it doesn't change the fact that, okay, we got to, we're a strong group of friends that, are banded together to help each other out. But, it's a little harder when, there's no borders to say we're going, like, hey, that's not cool, blah, 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 right? It's just like, so it's, I think it's a reflection of the complexities of the world these days, right? In terms of like, okay, well, the otherness is not so clearly defined as the way it was before,
Right.
right? And so I think that's how, again, just if you just read the news these days, you can see that it is the challenge, right? Like, okay, well, and it's and it's not put in the same terms as it was in the Cold War.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
it was easy, like with the commies, right? Now it's just like, well, there's a whole bunch of other things going on, right? And we have to pay, like, it's it's an evolving landscape, right?
Can
An
you
evolving security environment.
can you talk about Vietnam as the other, as it relates to in the pre-war, pre-Vietnam War, during the war, and even current to today? What's sort of been our relationship with NATO as it's been evolving?
Well, the thing with Vietnam, I mean, like, because NATO stands for the North Atlantic
Right.
Treaty Organization, so a lot of its focus has been, Euro-Atlantic, right? So again, the original idea is that, it was there to help contain, the Soviet threat, right? So, and things like Southeast Asia, like areas like Southeast Asia, weren't necessarily, the main, concern for the alliance, right? It was out of territory, right? Like, part of the treaty focuses on the fact that this is very
Got it.
geographically bound, right? So, I mean, I think there was attention paid to Vietnam, in the sense that a lot of allies were had a lot of activities in Vietnam during, like, the Cold War, right? I mean, Vietnam plays such an integral part of the Cold War, right? That outside of the NATO bubble, like, again, everything that was happening in France, and especially in the US, right, would have echoes, like, again, NATO allies were probably informed, but it was just more for information's sake, right? Because if there was going to be a discussion about, forces, forces stationed in Europe, well, if you're sending a whole bunch of forces to deal with that situation out there, how is that going to,
Right.
affect how you're going to contribute to what we're doing over here, right? That kind of thing. Or, I mean, again, a lot about NATO is all about information sharing, right? So it's like, okay, well, what's going on there? What's the analysis of that situation? Do we see it affecting the situation in other areas that are closer to us? For example, how is your actions over there going to affect us over here? That kind of thing, right? So
Right.
a lot of it is intelligence building without actually, and again, so the American involvement in Vietnam has, again, NATO allies could probably disagree with it. They're like, we're not really cool with what you did, but that's your business, right? What we do together is a
Got
different
it.
story,
Got it.
right? And that's the challenge of alliances, right? Like you don't always have to agree on everything, but you have to agree on the key things that bind you, right? It's just like a marriage, right? It's like family, right? I mean, like when you're all around the table and you have to deal with something that has common interests to all of you, you have to figure a way out. But there are things outside that you're doing on your own that may not necessarily involve the family.
Got it.
So
Got
why
it.
should it?
Why does the U.S. pay an overwhelming, disproportionate majority to the fund?
Well, I mean, there's a larger, I can only speak to, let's say, the historical, like from an historical perspective, right? That's not, this is, that whole question isn't necessarily my go-to subject. But I would say, if you look at it historically, right? I mean, like NATO coming out of it, in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, right? One of the things that, like again, one of the things that's part of U.S. foreign policy is, an investment in Europe. I mean, that's what the Marshall Plan is, right? A complete reinvestment in the rebuilding of Europe, right? Because a strong Europe was, like it was in the U.S.'s best, interests to have a strong Europe to contain, the Soviet Union, right? And if a strong Europe meant helping them to get back up on their feet, get their industries going again, get their economies going again, and helping out with the defense and bringing people together, right? That was in the U.S.'s best interest, and it still is in the U.S. best interests, right? And that's been part of the, let's say, that kind of U.S. foreign policy ever since the Second World War, which led to things like Vietnam and, and all the other activities that kind of fell in the wake, right? I mean, like, sure, like Japan, even, like again, the reconstruction of Japan, its presence in Korea. I mean, like, the U.S. has always been heavily involved in that kind of stuff. In defense, especially. Defense has been a great, because there are side benefits, collateral benefits to that defense investment, right? I mean, like, with defense investments comes cultural and economic advantages, right? Business opportunities, right? I mean, like, it's not like as if they're, like I think sometimes the way it's presented, in kind of headline news, is like, oh, the U.S. is paying a whole bunch. Well, it's not as if you're not getting anything back, I mean, like, it's like any investment, right? I mean, like, yes, it seems, if you're going to do it, if you're going to look at the numbers in a certain kind of way, yeah, it's easy to, I don't think it's hard to say that, it's easy to point out and to make an argument that, oh, you're being ripped off, right? But, if you look at it in if you allow it to have a much more complex reading and a much more wider reading, you see that, okay, yeah, the numbers say a certain kind of things, but there are other numbers that balance it out, right? And, again, I think the renewed relationship that comes with the current administration that's basically saying, like,
We're back on.
This is an important relationship, right? It is, working together is important, right? And I think it's kind of shown, right? I mean, like, I would point you to what's his name, NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg. He was invited to speak to Congress in 2000, I think it was 19, and he really laid it out there. It's a very good speech, and he really lays it out to Congress, and therefore, by extension, the American people, exactly what the point NATO is, what it means, what this alliance means to the states, and what the States means to the Alliance.
I imagine that there's not a whole lot of people that look like you inside of NATO.
Yeah, when I arrived, very little. It's changing, which is good, but it's not like like it's been a very refreshing change over the last year or so to meet other Vietnamese people that have come to work in the organization. One of the amusing things it was, and we kind of have, it's kind of like, oh, that kind of secret wink that we see each other and we kind of like, oh, because we all a lot of us share the same last name, Nguyen, right? And so we keep getting each other's emails, right? It's just like, no, you want the other one, right? And so we kind of make jokes about that stuff, right? And just like any, again, and it's interesting to me how these kind of patterns kind of reestablish themselves, right? So, oh, okay, like, oh, we see each other, and oh, like, hey, another Nguyen, and we, jokingly call each other cuz, or like things like that. Yeah.
And is it a Vietnamese American or Canadian, or where's that
They're
person
mainly,
from?
I mean, I've met some Vietnamese Americans, but there are also some, let's say, if you want to call them Vietnamese Europeans, right? But like I said, it's changing. I mean, like I can count on two hands how many Vietnamese there are, and that's like progressive.
Right, very.
When I first arrived, I was like, literally, I looked around. I'm like, yep, like I'm going to be confused for the IT guy. I mean, there's no question about it, right? And I have been, but it's like like I said, the patterns that form, right? I mean, like we've created a little kind of email group, and then we're trying to like, hey, have you found a place to have good pho, and things like that. Where's the good places to eat here, right? And we kind of share that information, right? And so it's been a nice little kind of like, again, these are patterns, these are like displacement patterns that kind of repeat themselves, right? It's like, oh, where's your similarities? Where are you looking for similar experiences that are relatable to each other, that are based on our cultural, and ethnic identities, right? Where do you find the good food?
If you are a Vietnamese person, there's a dozen or so of you working in this sort of cool section. Do you ever think about like the identity of who you are versus where you work?
Well, I mean, that's all, like being one of the things I've noted in the professional environments that I've circulated, especially at this level, right, at the national and the international level, is that, in a place like NATO, and especially in Europe, outside of an organization like the United Nations organizations, right, where it's literally like every country in the world is a part of it, right? Whereas NATO, NATO's very, again, Euro-Atlantic, North America, Canada, and then a whole bunch of European, continental European countries, right? So most of the time, somebody like, Asian would come, the assumption is that, oh, you're coming from North America, or especially you're coming from North America and you're military, right? Because that's the only way you would get in here, right? That type of thing. And I've been, and I think having seen, I have family who are Vietnamese that grew up in Europe, and I've found it very, very challenging to kind of break that glass ceiling, to get into these kinds of organizations because of, let's say, the almost kind of like the limitations that their identity has, kind of imposed on them because of the social structure of the situation. I mean, like, it's very frustrating on their part, right? I mean, like, it's almost like the game is rigged against them, right? I mean, like, they didn't go to the right schools, or they don't know the right people because of a certain kind of thing, because their parents didn't know the right people, and so on and so forth, right? It would take that really special person to actually break through, and then, kind of makes, have that kind of social network, the equivalent of the Ivy League social network, so that they could, have their children circulate in those environments, to be able to make the networks, to get into, to have even the awareness of getting into a place like this, right? And I think that's part of it. Is just like, I mean, I'm I'm fairly candid about the fact that I consider myself extremely lucky to be
Hmm.
where I am, because I didn't plan to be where I am. I stumbled into where I am, right? I mean, I never said to myself that, like you asked earlier, what did you want to, did you have an idea where you wanted to go? I had no idea that I could, like this was going to be a destination, a professional destination for me. I never even considered it. I
Yeah.
didn't even know it existed, right? And I didn't know people, or it's just that I was just never exposed to it, right? It was never a possibility for me, right? It was only by meeting other people that they told me about it, and then even then, when they told me about it, I was just like, I don't think I've got what it takes there, you know. But I did, like, and being here, I think, and this links to, again, goes right back to the question that you started with. How do you feel? What does it mean to be Vietnamese? Being Vietnamese, and being singled out in many ways in a place like this, right? For me is, like, I just want to, like, I consider myself extremely fortunate, and I'm very aware that, I want to be at least, you know, I don't want to say a role model, but I want to be somebody that, like, hey, if he can do it, what's to stop me from doing it, right? I mean, like, I don't want to say I'm being, I'm both conscious and unconscious of being representative, right? I mean, like, okay, I'm Vietnamese, and so, you know,
Yeah.
I'm, I want other, because I want my kids, for example, to not think about the fact that, oh, it's hard to get in there because of who we are. That I want them to be, like, I'm hoping that by the time they have kids, that it'll be completely normalized. That this is just a path that's really kind of open to everyone, without those kinds of that kind of interior blockage.
Yeah, I appreciate you having that mentality and that way of that open way of thinking, because it is a part of the work that I do, is showcasing the experience of Vietnamese throughout the world. It's if we could see that there are Vietnamese at NATO doing very high level tasks, then it opens up the possibility of many other opportunities, not just within an organization like NATO, but perhaps NASA or at the UN, that we can function at these high levels and we can do the jobs. And it's not that we're not thinking that we're capable, I think, on a brain or academic or intellectual level. It's just sometimes are limited by the fact that we don't see the Nick Wins up in that area, right? Even though you're there, you exist, you've been there for over a decade, but we don't know about it. And when I saw your cousin Andrew's post, I just saw NATO, and that instantly made me have to reach out to Andrew, just because I saw that, it's a branding thing that we get to see. And oh my God, there's somebody with my last name in that position. And now to find out that you work in the archival department, it's even more, we can direct questions to you.
Yeah, well, I find it interesting. First of all, thank you very much. It's very kind of you to say so. And the notion that for you, as you said, this all started with a photo, right? You saw a photo of me, and it raised a question. And part of it is, that photo led to understanding the context of exactly what surrounds the photo, and the fact that, like, in the role that I have, and I'm very, and I count myself extremely lucky to be able to be visible, to be, to be able to, I work, you know, I help preserve the institutional memory of the organization. In other words, I can speak about the history of the organization, right? And so being able to do that, and provide, and especially coming from, and allowing it to have a certain kind of perspective, in many, this is like, of all people, I'm one of the people that is the quote unquote the keepers of the gatekeepers of the secrets, right? I have an understanding of, the history and the development and the evolution of the organization, right? And I can speak to it, right? And I do speak to it, right? I give guided tours to the headquarters, for example, right? And I welcome, visitors of all generations and cultures and everything like that. And I try to, I try to tailor the visit to their experiences so that they get something out of it, right? So that it's that history, like that the history of the organization is multifaceted as opposed to static, right? And that's the challenge. And again, this is where, again, it goes back to the questions that we, that kind of keep coming back in our conversation about identity,
Right.
Like, a Romanian visitor versus, a Slovakian visitor versus a Danish visitor. I mean, those are worlds of difference apart of it in terms of their experience. But okay, well, they're all coming here for the thing that binds them, which is this thing called NATO. So, what, it's like a puzzle for me. How do I engage? How do I get them to get it from their perspective, but also, have it a mutually kind of balanced kind of experience where they see it from not only their perspective, but also from, an historical perspective or the organizational perspective. And so what's the, and so that they can understand and cultivate their own relationship to it, right? Not only its past, but what it's doing now and its future. And if they want to get involved in it, they're there for a reason. They're visiting for a reason. So, let's open that up a little bit.
A common question that I have at my family's dinner table throughout the years with my parents, my brother, our family, we talk about the world becoming an actual better place or not. That's the debate that we talk about. Do you feel, after all of your work at NATO and reading so much documents and learning about the world's history from where you are, do you feel like the world is actually becoming a better place?
Well, the world has always, for me, the world has always had the potential to be a better place. Like I think it's, making sure that, people understand its complexities is feeds that potential. Keeping it black and white, keeping it having it at a very binaristic kind of perspective is very dangerous to me, right? Because like if we accept ourselves as complex individuals, I think groups of us are therefore going to be even more complex, and then understanding differences and similarities is what makes life better, right? That kind of empathy, that kind of recognition, that kind of negotiation, right? That kind of understanding, right? I mean, like, that's work, that's labor, right? It's breaking through all of that. In many ways, that's, that is the ideal of what something like NATO is, right? This is like, we're a whole bunch of people, we all come from different backgrounds. We got to find a way to agree on certain things. We may not agree on everything, but we got to find common ground, right? And that ideal is something that's very attractive to me, right? And I think even especially on a personal basis, right? Is just kind of like, and it's in many ways, again, it informs the project that you're doing, right? This multitude of voices that spans across generations, across countries, across times, and yet you're trying to build an understanding, leave a trace, a memory for future generations to understand, a common experience that, really kind of spread all of us out into different areas, and listening to these voices. And then, again, by listening to them, understanding differences and everything like that, to have an ultimate understanding, like outcome of, okay, I have a better idea of people, again, what the Vietnamese in this context, what a Vietnamese experience is, what the complexity of Vietnamese identity is, and can be, or as a result of all of, of the experiences that have shaped not only individually but collectively and historically, politically, and everything like that. So that the question of Vietnamese then becomes a rich one, and if you embrace the richness of complexity, that I think makes the world a better place, because then it encourages curiosity, right, as opposed to complacency.
It's a great answer, and I think we're missing
for me,
a lot of that.
Like curiosity is like one of the best character traits that, again, the need to explore, the need to grow, the need to learn, to to make, and I mean, a lot about learning is about making relationships between things, building bridges, making connections.
Yeah,
Right.
and I hope that the platforms, the social media platforms that exist in the world today, there's a lot of good stuff about each platform. Recently I've fell into TikTok and I love it. It's great to
Mm-hmm.
promote the podcast with snippets, 60-second clips, 15-second clips. These are great to whet the appetite, but I'm not sure if it transfers over to a long form, where long form lives on a Spotify or lives on a YouTube. So there's different platforms for different sort of uses, like you were talking about earlier. Contextually, information changes wherever it's placed. This is all a very wonderful thing that we have social media, but I don't know if people's attention spans or the polarization of people's sort of belief systems is clouding the ability to think further and ask questions or go to seek answers for their curiosity. Are people really engaging with that information? From where you sit, do you think that people are the act of going out to satisfy that curiosity is increasing or decreasing as a result of computer algorithms and social media, sort of the way things are laid out today?
Well, I think one of the experiences that I enjoy the most, and it's the most challenging in the archives business, if you want, is the reference services, right? So people come and ask you questions. I'm looking for X, I'm curious, I'm working on this subject and I'm looking for documents related to this topic, and so my role, in the archives is to be able to facilitate their access to this information. I'm not a teacher. I mean, being an archivist is not necessarily being like a professor, right? So, like it's up to the researcher to do the best that they can with the information that is being made accessible to them. What I can do in my role as an archivist is to provide the context of that information, so that at least like certain assumptions, like let's say better quality assumptions can be made as opposed to left field assumptions, right? Like, okay, here's a bunch of data points, but without the context on those data points, they can go radically different ways that were, well beyond or well outside of the actual scope of what the actual data of and the context of that data it is, right? So being able to at least to provide the information that they are looking for, right? The actual data points, but then actually providing, okay, well here's and then this is where the relationship, this face-to-face human kind of let's say exchange comes in, where it's just like, oh, okay, well, because I know this data and how it comes about, again, archives is about creating context, the context of the creation of the documents. It gives, relaying that information, helping the researchers in that way get a better understanding of what they're working with. They'll retain that, and with the hope that it will help inform the interpretations that they make out of that data, and therefore hopefully make it stronger. Right.
Right. Have you
That's the best that we can do. That's the best
Yeah.
that I can do. Right. I mean, like, I can't tell them how to write their paper.
Right.
I can't tell them how to interpret this. Right. That would be the same philosophy that I had as an instructor, as a teacher. Right. I'm like, as a student, I'm not, like the whole point of the class is not to tell me what I already know, but here's part of it is that you develop, everyone develops their own perspective, but at least if it's grounded in, like I say, in a certain kind of, like actual, again, the actualities and the complexities of its, like of everything surrounding it, it becomes a lot more, again, it has the potential to be, a richer and more engaging argument that's being presented that one can easily bounce back off of and, really have an actual exchange.
Have you been back to Vietnam?
Yeah, I've been back 3 times. The first time I went back was in 1999, and then right afterwards again in 2000, and then again in 2016. So again, 1999 is one of those big years for me. In 1999, I had stopped my engineering career, I was transitioning to go into film studies at that point. So that first trip was between just right after I quit engineering and before I started school. So it was a major, I really consider it a major kind of like, okay, milestone moment in my life, because that's where things really changed. It's like I really kind of stepped out on my own, right? Like in terms of, okay, I'm choosing a career a career path that is of my making, as opposed to something that I was guided to,
Yeah,
right?
that's a scary move, huh?
Right. And the fact that it coincides with a moment of me, like, again, going back to Vietnam and literally leaving the continent of North America for the first time, and to go of all places, to go back to my roots, to discover my heritage, right? Just as before I embark on a project that's about me, that is for, where all the energies are focused on, the direction and the path that I'm carving out for myself, right? That was quite significant to me, right? Especially in hindsight. I knew it at the time, but, it becomes more and more confirmed, as I got older. I'm like, no, 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 no. Happy coincidence, in the sense that of all times I decide to go back, it's that time as opposed to earlier. Part of it is like I couldn't really go back, right? It was very difficult to go back to Vietnam until, I mean, even 1999, it was still kind of rough.
Yeah.
The infrastructure was still just tourism infrastructure for especially, North Americans was just starting to kind of develop. European travelers had been discovering it for a while. But even then too, when my parents went back in 1994 for the first time, like it was pretty hot for them, right? It was just kind of like it was a challenge. I remember actually being a little concerned about them, like because of their like the history of their political activism, and their outspokenness about like the government of Vietnam. I mean, like I knew that they would be on some kind of like watch list, and they were. And they would be, like they could, once they're in there, like anything could happen, right? I mean, like anything is say, well, you didn't, you don't have this paper, so you have to stay, or
Yeah.
make some stupid trouble for them, right? But it didn't happen. But so that their trip helped pave the way for my trip. So then they say, oh, it's okay for you to go. Here's the people, here's the family that you want to get in touch with, and again, that notion of meeting, relatives that you'd never met before, but those bonds of kinship are all of a sudden just immediate, right? Like the hospital, how it is. Like in terms of, our codes of hospitality, especially with kin, it's just like, wow, lay out the red carpet, even though the red carpet is like, what we, like, whoa, they're really giving me, the best that they can offer, right? And so very humbling when you see, especially the different conditions that they were living in at the time, right? And yet, never met these people before, but they treat me like their son.
Yeah.
Right? It's an incredible feeling, right? And then discovering, like again, the mixed feelings that you had, especially going back for me in 1999, like, whoa, like what a, this is the life that could have been, like, or what has happened since then, right? Like to see traces of things, to see attitudes that, like you're not comfortable with, right? Confronting, if you want to call it, your own other, right? Literally face to face, right? It's just kind of like, this is, it's like literally, and I think you've come across this saying, it was very popular, at least when I went back in 1999, same, but different.
Yeah.
Right? Like they would, like many Vietnamese would say that about me when they'd recognize me, they'd be like, oh, because they had seen Viet Q before, right? Like, especially Vietnamese that were born in North America and then had come and visited. They could easily tell those immediately, right? They're like, oh, okay, you're same, but different. But when it came to me, because I held a very kind of like almost liminal kind of position, right? Because I was born in Vietnam, and part of that first wave that raised the second wave refugee immigrant. A lot of the like I still embodied a lot of the old traditions, right? I was taught with the old traditions. I spoke, some words I said had a certain kind of accent to them, certain actions that I had, I followed up with certain codes of, let's say, like honorifics and, like politeness and respect for the elders and all that stuff. Like when I would, when I would go through those, when I would just, kind of be the person that I was raised to be, right? All of a sudden, that's when they even realize, well, wait a minute, you're different, right? You're same, but different. You do things the right way, like us, but still you have a difference about you. But you still do, you do things that we recognize, right? That was very kind of gratifying to me, right? In the sense that, like it's nice that I felt very gratified of that sense of recognition that, like there is a part of me that's still here, that is linked to here, and they're recognizing it, right? As much as I'm coming in as a complete tourist.
In the overall big scheme of the Vietnamese history, what is our responsibility or our role, our position in the history and the future of Vietnam?
That's a good question. I mean, I kind of think I don't know about the royal we. I think about it in terms of, let's say, because I recognize that, I'm coming from a very specific moment of in time and space and history of Vietnamese history. That, walking forward, and I think about this a lot because of my kids, right? And like making sure that they understand where they come from, right? And again, I think trying to lead by example is basically what my responsibility is, I say, in terms of like, okay, well, here's, again, being Vietnamese has a very kind of, I don't want to say stigma, but certain assumptions to it, being of a certain age, right? Like, when it becomes illuminated, like, you were born as a result, during the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War has for a specific generation of people, it has a certain kind of meaning to them, whereas it has very little meaning to other, like younger people. Vietnam War, that's way before my time, right? That's Rambo, right? That type of thing, right? It's way, it's like a video game, right? Yeah. So part of it is like as the memory of the war recedes, right? Like it'll be 50 years in 2025 that, like our world changed, right? That's that's a couple generations, right? Part of it is, and Vietnam celebrates that day, April 30th, differently than the way we do, right? I know for my parents, it's a day of great sadness, right? Of a day when their lives changed and they had to say goodbye. Were forced to say goodbye to, certain things, certain ways of life, certain memories, certain potential lives, right? Whereas Vietnam, the country of Vietnam, celebrates it as a day of, newfound identity, of independence, right? Of, and constantly looking forward, right? Like we're after all this time, 50 years later, look at where we are now. We have Avengers Tower in Saigon type of thing, right? And, we're a new economic power, et cetera, right? That kind of celebration, right? And I get it. Like, good for you, right? You accomplished what you wanted to accomplish, right? But it's more complex than that, right? And I want to, for me, I guess by leading by example is always making sure that, like at least as much of a full story is told rather than, a monolithic kind of narrative, which is about winners and losers. Right? There's just kind of like, no. I mean, again, for the longest time, and it's one of the interesting things that I think that's happening now is that there's a lot more, especially in popular culture, and like, you see it a lot in comics, especially in memoirs, is that the memories or the memory of, South Vietnam is starting to articulate itself, right? This forgotten, like the South Vietnamese army, the veterans, things like that. People, like again, for the longest time, as a result of American movies or, even American history, basically have, basically laid the blame, to, South Vietnamese forces and the whole of South Vietnam for falling, right? Well, it was a corrupt government and useless and, like completely, like buckled once the Americans left and all that stuff, right? I mean, like, and there's kind of, as a result, I think for the longest time, and this is, I think, has, kind of permeated some of our, at least our parents' generation and certain members of our parents' generation, there's been a sense of shame about the circumstances, right? And
Yeah, definitely.
and it's particularly tough to experience and to see, right? I mean, when and so I think those stories, those voices, deserve to be heard and healed in many ways. To again, to kind of give that sense of complexity to the larger narrative, the larger Vietnam narrative, right? Because our results, our very being, where we are today, is a result of a cataclysmic event at a local level, that changed, our parents' lives, right? And on a global scale, right? Sure, the Vietnam War, it has its place in geopolitics, Cold War, and everything like that. At the human level, though, we are the results. We're the results of that. And so, in terms of the future of what people like you and I do, well, I totally admire what you're doing. I think you're doing exactly what I would aspire to do, which is to keep the complexity of voices and stories and questions about identity alive. Right? You're creating a living archive, of recordings, of voices, of people's experiences, of what it means to be, Vietnamese as a result of living at this particular moment in time and space.
Thank you for being part of the archive and being part of this sort of living work in progress, if you will. I hope to, today we covered a lot of ground, and I think that there's so much more to cover. And in the future, I've talked to you about this before. I would love to have you on, in these mini panels that I plan to put together with filmmakers, other writers, and other creatives in the Vietnamese diaspora, and also within the Vietnamese groups in Vietnam itself. And
I was going to say with pleasure. I mean, like I've still got I've still got lots of other things to kind of relate to. I mean, I think, in terms of the things that I've experienced and things that I've observed, as well, that link up to some of the questions that are not only tangential to some of the things that you've asked, but also add and supplement to some of the things that I've said as well. And that I think might, especially in having it in a group situation where, they can, those kinds of observations can easily kind of bounce off each other and enhance the conversation as well. I'd be extremely honored to continue this journey with you.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. Thank you again for coming on today. And we're gonna have to do this again very soon, because there's a lot more bullet points that I want to cover. But I think it's I need to shift the narrative into a different, I know that when you get, because I've heard the podcast, you were on another podcast that I'd mentioned before, you started to speak about Eisenhower, and you went so deep with just that one topic that I know the intellectual prowess that you're capable of to get and drill down into one topic. So there's still so much to cover in the future about the history of Vietnam as she relates to the entire world. And from your perspective, I'd love to get more information and build upon this conversation in a few months.
With pleasure, Kenneth, with pleasure.
Thanks again, Nick. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to The Vietnamese with Kenneth Nguyen. The Vietnamese is produced by Brittany Tran and Javier Proenza. Special thanks to Jane Nguyen, Catherine Nguyen, Tina Pham, Sydney Jamie, and Christo Trin. Please find us on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok at The Vietnamese Podcast. You can also find us on YouTube, where you can subscribe, like, and comment. Please rate and give us a review wherever you find our podcasts. Thanks again for listening.